Good evening and welcome to the final event of our series. Today we will talk about gender equality in European Union policy, and we are very pleased to have Professor Dolores Morondo Taramundi with us as our keynote speaker of the day. Morondo Taramundi is currently head of research at the Human Rights Institute at the University of Deusto, where she has been involved in several international and national research projects. She has worked as an independent expert for the European Commission in projects on human rights and institutional building, and she is also currently the Spanish representative in the European Network of Legal Experts on Gender Equality Law. It's really a pleasure to have her with us today to help us think through the challenges and the possibilities of gender equality in EU policies. So thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Orsetta for the invitation, and to Sara for this very nice presentation. I'm very pleased to join in and to take part in these dialogues. I'm going to try to share my screen, which it has worked before, but maybe not now. Okay, let's see. Now it does not see my PowerPoint. I don't know why.
Dolores, prima funzionava?
Sì, queste cose fanno sempre così, funzionano nel rehearsal e poi niente.
Se provi a condividere lo schermo, sì.
Allora, vediamo se mi fa...
Adesso sta per arrivare.
Vedete quello che non
Dice
è?
che hai avvisato la condivisione.
Ok, now
Perfetto.
we
Adesso
can
vediamo.
see.
Adesso lo vedete?
Sì, vediamo
Yeah.
tutto
Okay,
qua.
perfect then. So again, thank you very much. I must say that my intention, my good intentions, as always, was to have this work much more progressed by this time of the year, but it is still quite part of a wider, ongoing, maybe never-ending research project on structural inequality, which I am currently developing also in the context of a European sister project to WeFrame, which is rewiring. I mean, in this, we are finishing, or we are at the end of this project, Rewiring, Realizing Girls and Women's Inclusion, Representation and Empowerment, which is coordinated by the University of Utrecht. I don't know, I've tried to make this QR code. I'm not very sure if it's working, but you have there the link to the webpage if you're interested. My objective with this in this study of structural inequality is to assess the strategies against the structural inequality and the challenges encountered in doing so in the wider equality regulatory framework that is encompassing both anti-discrimination law and equality policy. It is now a common criticism to acknowledge that anti-discrimination law is inadequate or limited, equipped to achieve or even to lead to the kind of transformation required by the persisting, pervasive, and substantial disadvantage or systemic patterns of disadvantage and harm that are endured by women and by other oppressed and subordinated groups. My aim thus is to check equality policies beyond anti-discrimination law and see whether they are also affected by similar or different limitations, and to assess the relationships between anti-discrimination law and equality policy and their respective potential and limitations. Although I have done some brief historical review of European policies, my analysis has, for the moment, mostly focused on the last 15 years of equality policies, so going back to the gender equality strategy of 2010-2015. And I'm still at a very early or first phase of this research, trying to figure out the categories with which I could interrogate policy documents. So my reflections at this point are merely tentative, and I have no systematic support for them. They are, let's say, they are documented guesses. So the first thing, structural inequality, which is our dragon, my dragon. If we try to assess the strategies and the challenges of the EU gender equality policy against structural inequality, we need to confront, first of all, two orders of problems. Problems with the definition of structural inequality, and problems around the relationship between equality regulatory framework, anti-discrimination law and equality policy, and structural inequality itself. So the first group of problems, those regarding the definition. Here we have the problem that structural inequality is not clearly defined, nor is there an agreed upon definition of structural inequality. In EU documentation, the expression structural inequality has been used since the early 90s and increasingly in the last years. The seemingly synonymous expression structural discrimination, which is the preferred usage in the EU documentation, appeared even earlier in one document in 1980 and more consistently since the late 90s. Most of these uses do not concern sex-gender equality, though, or equality between men and women, or between women and men, because the EU policy documentation uses all these expressions. But they normally refer to racism or to Roma discrimination. In connection to sex equality, the use of structural discrimination and structural inequality is more recent, since the mid-2000s. In the anti-discrimination as opposed to sex equality literature, so the body of literature that has been developed in relation to the directives of 2000, of the year 2000, so on the other grounds of discrimination which are not sex, in that kind of literature and documentation, structural discrimination, often referred to as systemic or institutional discrimination, and sometimes in a specific context as structural or institutional racism, is not merely the result of isolated acts committed by prejudiced individuals. Instead, it is presented as rooted in the procedures, routines, and organizational culture of institutions. These processes often contribute to less favorable outcomes for minority groups compared to the majority of the population, frequently operating without deliberate discriminatory intent. Structural discrimination generates entrenched disadvantage across the full spectrum of civic and economic life. So in these uses of the expression structural discrimination or structural inequality, I find that there is a lack of distinctiveness of the phenomenon. In my opinion, two things are especially or particularly problematic. The first is the interchangeable use of structural inequality and structural discrimination. So the lack of distinction between inequality and discrimination when they are qualified as structural. And the second thing that I find it's also problematic is the interchangeable use of structural, systemic, or institutional when qualifying inequality and or discrimination. Beyond the lack of a distinct phenomenon, I also find problematic the critical reception of US literature, which seems to be at odds with definitions of discrimination in Europe, because none of the categories of discrimination, direct or indirect, in Europe necessitates discriminatory intent or malice. So it is difficult to see how the absence of this discriminatory intent or malice can distinguish structural discrimination from indirect discrimination or even direct discrimination. Also, the entrenched disadvantage and the pervasive nature of structural discrimination do not seem characteristics that can set apart structural discrimination from, for example, indirect discrimination, but even direct discrimination can occur and has occurred across the full spectrum of civic and economic life. Regarding the second group of problems for structural inequality, this is what I meant. This is the relationships between structural inequality and the regulatory framework for equality. In view of the persistence and in some cases the increase of inequality, also under jurisdictions with functioning equality regulatory frameworks, it would be remiss not to interrogate the relation between structural inequality and the regulatory framework for equality, law and policy. Does persistent inequality point to inherent flaws of the system? So, is sex equality law programmed to fail, as Eliane Fogel-Polsky warned us? Or are those evident incapacities the result of choices in the politics of equality law and policy that can be changed? To answer this question, the first thing that I think it is important to understand is that we should not undervalue the place of structural inequality in our political and regulatory systems, and not only in our lived experiences. So we do recognize that structural inequality is a very important real phenomenon that can be measured, but we are less aware, or at least the documentation seems to be less aware of the place structural inequality has within the regulatory frameworks. It is not easy to establish in a clear-cut manner the role of equality in the democratic construction of our political societies. Equality is, on the one hand, a driving element of the very idea of democracy. Equality before the law has had this double phase. On the one hand, it established the single jurisdiction in modern states, thus creating the equal political subject and the subject of rights, that is, the citizen. And on the other hand, its meaning as a prohibition of arbitrariness sets the foundations of the rule of law. So equality, in that sense, is a very important element in the idea of the modern democratic state itself. However, despite the importance that political philosophy or political philosophies attribute to the idea of equality in the construction of the democratic state and the rule of law, history shows us, political and legal history shows us, a rather different reality. Even the foundational texts that created the single and equal subject, the citizen, and established the principle of equality before the law, were designed not to be applied to the majority of people under their mantle. The paradox that the motto, "the land of the free," referred to a slave-owning society, or that the author of the female paraphrasing of the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen lost her head, literally for forgetting the virtues of her sex, demonstrate the capacity that inequality and oppression had to mesh with democracy and the rule of law. The power to naturalize and render invisible the knots of power. If anyone is thinking, well, yes, but this was a long time ago and things are different now, they are obviously, but partially right. Through the various democratization movements and the introduction of a principle of non-discrimination in the mid-20th century, the international documents and new constitutions, we see a leap from equality before the law to equality in the law. The legislator cannot legitimately attribute rights, burdens, and opportunities in an unreasonable manner based on characteristics that define the social status of oppressed groups, sex, race, religious affiliation, etc. Just as the previous process, which enshrined equality before the law, also equality in the law failed to uproot the structures of inequality to which the very idea of modern democracy and the rule of law had been molded. Sociology, anthropology, economics show incontestable data on the persistence of inequality. Íñigo, estoy... No, me están viendo. Sorry. Sociology, anthropology, economics show incontestable data on the persistence of inequality between social groups that are defined by characteristics that constitute traditional statuses of oppression. The combination of equality before the law and equality in the law constitutes the idea of formal equality or legal equality. Faced with social pressure denouncing the persistence of various inequalities, political and theoretical discourse on equality and its policies made a further leap that many post-Second World War constitutions captured and institutionalized. It is the introduction of the dichotomy formal equality, substantive equality. I have criticized elsewhere this formal equality, substantive equality dichotomy, seemingly simple and which appears to exhaust the idea of equality. The use of this dichotomy in the European Union, and not only there, appears as an instance of the classic division appearance reality. Formal, apparent equality in law coexist with real inequalities in society, such that only substantive equality, which occurs in reality and can be measured with various indicators, would be real. Legal culture has adopted this formal substantive dichotomy to argue that legal equality is only or fundamentally the formal one, while the other equality, the real or substantive one, is an empirical extra-legal fact. If the lawmaker takes an interest in that other factual, non-legal equality, it can exceptionally adopt measures that deviate from formal equality, the proper legal one, to remove the obstacles that prevent the achievement of substantive equality through the mere application of legal equality norms. But it must do so in a cautious manner and with strict requirements, because we are restricting a fundamental right, the legal right to equality. The impasse created by this configuration of formal equality, substantive equality persists to this day. And yes, I am aware of the importance of the distinction between tactics and strategy in feminist thinking, so I'm not proposing to ditch substantive equality. But it is precisely when we look at it from a strategic point of view that we see how the dichotomy formal equality, substantive equality has led to a technical and conceptual divergence between anti-discrimination law and equality policies. The political error of maintaining that the law can prefigure an objective for equality norms that is different from the achievement of substantive equality means that the use of law to transform social group inequalities is problematic and even contradictory. And we have a very recent example in one judgment of one of the latest judgments of the Court of Justice of the European Union regarding affirmative action, and in this case, the pension supplement intended to mitigate the gender pension gap, which has been considered contrary to the prohibition of sex discrimination. If socially mere formal equality is considered an appearance, legally, substantive equality appears as an exception. In any case, everyone agrees that these are two distinct equalities. This is the magnitude of the problem that we are confronting. Structural inequality is not an aberration in democratic terms or in relation to the rule of law. It is not a fringe phenomenon. Structural inequality is ingrained in our systems from their very foundation, and it seems largely immune to the mechanisms of the dichotomy formal equality, substantive equality. The awareness of the pervasiveness of structural inequality and its immunity in relation to a growingly sophisticated equality regulatory system, the growing instability of the European anti-discrimination system too, which I have treated elsewhere, but we can discuss later if you want, the incoherence that has been noticed, for example, by Sara Benedi La Huerta within EU law and related policies, all these are reasons to review the relationship that is established between the regulatory framework and structural inequality. How are we posing the problem? Should we agree with Audre Lorde that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house? In a recent essay, Audre outlines this relationship in a rather paradoxical way. Law is considered a tool in the process of both enacting and addressing structural harm. She lists substantive equality, intersectionality, indirect discrimination, or reasonable accommodation as examples where discriminatory harm is structural because it is not the result of an action of a morally blameworthy individual or an explicit institutional policy. Instead, she says, the harm transpires in the course of the liberal order, that is, just how the world is organized. Her take on this is that although structural harm is self-perpetuating because it is supported by the liberal order, or just how things operate, it can also be undone with attentive unraveling of the ways in which dominant structures, such as law and policy, are implicated. Equality law, she concludes, appears conceptually open to the possibility of both reckoning with and redressing the causal complexity of structural harms. Myself, I must say that I'm not fond of paradoxes. If law and policy are both the tools for reproducing structural inequality and protecting it from scrutiny, and the tools for reckoning and redressing structural harms, I think we should review the way that we are posing the problem. And for this, I have resorted to the technique of problematization used by Carol Bakke's model, What's the Problem Represented to Be? To interrogate the relationship between the regulatory framework and structural inequality, and understand the way we pose structural inequality as a problem. I'm not very sure whether you are familiar with this problematization model, so I've just had this very brief summary. In Carol Baki's model, problematization challenges the presumption that the purpose of policy is to solve social problems. And it starts from the premise that policies give shape to problems rather than merely addressing them. The aim of problematization is to undermine the taken for granted status of problems as true or real, and open the terms of reference within which an issue is cast to scrutiny, rather than it is not the aim of problematization to improve policy solutions as such, but to put into question things that we take for granted. Yet, I think that posing the problem more accurately, more honestly, or more correctly might be the only chance we have to think effective solutions to such a persisting and elusive issue as structural inequality. Following this insight, I am testing through a first interrogation of texts how has structural inequality how it has been understood as a problem by gender equality strategies and policy documents. I have also used structural discrimination as a code unit because the texts of the European Commission, they use both of them. And at the moment, for what I see, it's an interchangeable expression. I found not criteria yet for setting them apart. So I have interrogated the text regarding both structural inequality and structural discrimination. Of the various questions that are proposed in Carol Baki's model, and that are those 6 that you see on the slide, I'm most interested in the silences. That is question 2 on the presuppositions and the assumptions that underpin the representation of the problems, and question 4 on what it is left unproblematic and does not allow to think the problem differently. So what I intend to do is to interrogate these policy texts to understand what is not discussed in the identified problem representation, what cannot be talked about in an intelligible manner within the equality regulatory framework. Very provisionally, these are very provisional results because, as I said, I have not yet coded the text in a systematic manner. So this is it was a first immersion to look for categories. But in the representation of the problem, I have found these 4 points. So the representation of structural inequality as a problem has evolved over time in EU documentation, especially in the documentation of the European Commission. Early strategies focused on identifying and tackling symptoms that could be measured, like persistent gender pay differences or gender differences in pension, as well as low female market participation, or the bigger burden in care work. The objective when structural inequality was thought in this way, the objective was primarily to secure changes and support to women in some priority areas. Since 2016, there is an explicit recognition of violence against women as a manifestation of a structural discrimination against women, deeply rooted in gender inequality. And this has broadened the definition of structural discrimination beyond economic metrics to encompass social and physical harms. And in the current strategy, policy frameworks affirmed that gender inequalities are rooted in discriminatory social structures, institutions, legal norms, and practices. Unequal power dynamics, patriarchal values, and historical inequalities between men and women are presented as the foundation perpetuating the problem. The strategy addresses the different complex manifestations of structural inequality, the various gender gaps, gender violence, lack of effectiveness of equality law and policy. A second issue in the representation of the problem that I have found is this changing basis between social justice and economic integration or financial sustainability. Feminist scholars have long argued that gender equality policy might be used for national or international aims of economic policy rather than social justice. So it is not surprising that we find these kind of assumptions in the text of the strategies as well, with a recurrent use of the business case argument for gender equality. If we look, for example, at the gender care work gap, considered to be an important contributor of the salary and the pension gaps, the majority of the actions proposed in the gender strategies since 2010 concerned the reconciliation between work and private life of women and a focus on childcare provisions and with or through soft law measures at the beginning. Acknowledging women's differentiated burden regarding family responsibilities, the measures were outcome-oriented and did not deal with the unbalanced distribution of care responsibilities between men and women. The acknowledged purpose is to facilitate the permanence, the entry and the permanence of women in the labor market through their childbearing and child-rearing age, and minimize the impact that those responsibilities have on salary and pension accrues. And the strategy says reducing the strain on public finances and social protection systems. The introduction of hard law measures, for example, the 2019 directive, falls short of displacing this logic. If we look, the obligatory involvement of fathers is nowhere near an idea of equal division of care. If you compare the maternity leave and the paternity leave, they are not comparable. I think maternity leave is 7 times longer than paternity leave. But it is also that this hard law measure has been developed or has been adopted while we developed a discourse and a policy on the affordable migrant labor policy to provide care services. So again, we do not have a policy that is directed at the unbalanced distribution of care and the idea that everyone should care for all their relatives or children or themselves or their houses, but that women should be able to join and stay in the labor market, and for that the burden is shifted on poorer women or migrant women. A third issue that I've seen also an evolution in the definition of structural inequality as a problem is the idea of integral approaches. Whereas anti-discrimination law and equality policies have for a long time traveled different channels, with the Court of Justice occasionally clashing into equality policy strategies like especially equal opportunities and affirmative action, but also intersectionality and reasonable accommodation, or it has never enforced equality policies. For example, in the case of the mainstreaming, the gender mainstreaming or gender perspectives, it is true that we can see an increasing level of integration in the gender equality policy of the European Commission. The European Commission acknowledges the complexity of structural inequality issues, and it acknowledges that this complexity necessitates of both hard law, or hardish because they are directives, soft law, and public policy, and that all these should follow a coordinated aim and, as far as possible, a timetable that creates synergies and reinforces effectiveness. And this is very clear, for example, in the still current gender equality policy 2020-2025. Gender mainstreaming has gained momentum in all this, in this dual approach that we have seen over time of gender policies against structural inequality, which was affirmative action on the one hand and gender mainstreaming on the other. Gender mainstreaming has gained momentum and has passed from just declarations of intention to the development of an institutional setup, to the development of instruments, for example, the gender audits, gender budgeting, gender audits, or gender impact assessments. We are still short at the level of effectiveness, since there is nothing in the policy documents that points to the effects or the sanctions for violating the principle of mainstreaming. But it has evolved as part of this integral approach. Another point that I've also seen an evolution is around this point in the configuration of structural inequality as a problem is intersectionality. Intersectional groups and experiences of discrimination have been part of the sex equality strategies from the very beginning. However, it has been only in recent years that intersectionality has been assessed more deeply in relation to structural inequality, and not as a collection of especially vulnerable groups requiring extra attention or support, but rather as a characteristic of structural inequality itself that explains the important limitations of the successful performance of the regulatory framework. We have seen, for example, the introduction of intersectionality in gender equality law, although this has to be taken with a grain of salt because of two main reasons. One is that the horizontal directive maybe has been withdrawn. I mean, it had been withdrawn, but the Commission has said that they will get them back again. But the idea is that the horizontal directive is stalled. And this leaves important differences in the scope of protection of the different on the different grounds of discrimination, which makes intersectionality difficult to apply. But also because with the integration of intersectionality in the Pay Transparency Directive, there are no operative mechanisms. We do not know how it will be applied. What does it imply in terms of relevant comparator? What does it imply in terms of the construction of the idea of disadvantage? What is going to be considered evidence, etc. So it's true that intersectionality is gaining ground, but I think we are still quite far away from understanding what it means for structural inequality. The other, and with this I finish the other part of the interrogation, and that I've carried on the documentation is about the silences in how structural inequality is framed as a problem. And there are, in my opinion, three main silences. Maybe there are more, but these are the ones I found. The first one is the idea of fixed women, not institutions. This work as an assumption, as a presupposition of the way in which structural inequality is understood. Throughout the changes and the direction towards a narrower focus on root causes and gender structures, strategies based on the idea of fixing women have persisted. Notwithstanding the expanding scope of structural barriers, so that the importance that has been given to structural barriers, the hardcore idea that inequality can be solved by bringing women disadvantaged because of historical and lifelong cumulative forms of discrimination, that they have to bring women up to the level or the normal level of the male norm, is we can find that from the first strategies on equal opportunities or the first plans on equal opportunities up to today. Very clearly identifiable in these early strategies on equal opportunities and affirmative action, but also in actions regarding intersectional groups. We find all these training on employment opportunities, marketable skills, even mentoring programs to promote women's assertiveness and entrepreneurial spirit. The idea is that women need to be fixed, need to be brought up to level. A second issue that is not discussed, that is silenced or excluded from the way we shaped the problem of structural inequality, is privilege. So this fixing women approach resists as an implicit assumption because the male norm is not challenged. Although the documentation acknowledges or has lately acknowledged terms like patriarchy, historical subordination, and other terms that comes from the feminist discourse, it does not draw conclusions from it. Equality policy, and even more so anti-discrimination law, is contained to actions on what I have called elsewhere the lower threshold of inequality, to what you can do or not do to subordinated groups. You can have equality policy, anti-discrimination law protections that bring that lower threshold up with more proactive or effective measures. But what anti-discrimination law and equality policy do not do, they do not see even, let alone address, is the upper threshold of inequality, the accumulation of privilege, the male norm. So this is not only not discussed in the documentation that I've reviewed, it is not thinkable within that framework of discussion. The nearest you get to men or to male norms is to try to identify men as allies of feminism. And the third thing that is, of course, not discussed is capitalist market economy, liberalism, and neoliberalism. This I have not worked this very much yet because it's one of it's the last thing that I was coding. But as I said before, there is a strong use of the business case for equality, and there is a strong hold of the idea that gender equality serves the purpose of improving or strengthening the economy, and not necessarily social justice. This is this can be tested in, for example, in the things that are admitted as reform within the gender mainstreaming principles. As I said before, violations of the gender mainstreaming principle, they do not have sanctions yet. So you might reform, for example, we have studied the reform of the pension systems. You might reform the pension system in a way that you know that will have a negative impact on gender equality, on the gender pension. The gender pension, which is, for example, in the Netherlands, is 40%, will be increased by the recent pension reform system that they have introduced, and they know that, and still they have adopted that reform. But also, for example, in Spain, the pension system reform has, on the one hand, it introduces some patches like this supplement to mitigate the gender pension gap that has been caused by Luxembourg, whereas on the other hand, it promotes the privatization or the private pension schemes that are known to have a negative impact on the pension system. So gender equality is, or gender policy does not seem to have the force even to make, to bring to the discussion the fact that certain tenets of liberalism, neoliberalism, and capitalist market economy are not compatible with the struggle against structural inequality. And I would stop here and lead to the discussion.